Thank you and for joining me this afternoon. I would like to introduce the session first, which is non-state stakeholders in preventing WMD proliferation. While policymakers have generally recognized the military threat posed by weapons of mass destruction, they have tended to downplay or disregard the possibility that these weapons might be used by a non-state or transnational actor in a campaign of mass destruction terrorism. In addition, even in preventing WMD proliferation, policymakers have downplayed the role of non-state stakeholders and civil society. With this regard, this panel will discuss the role of non-state stakeholders in preventing WMD proliferation and implementing the UN Security Council Resolution 1540. So let me at the outset say that I'm the moderator. I introduce more on 1540 for the next 2 minutes, and then I will introduce the panel. And the speakers have 8 to 10 minutes to this topic. While I'm saying this, I also want to make sure that whatever I moderate or provide is my personal opinion. It's not the official position of the United Nations. The Security Council resolution, just as a background, has been adopted in 2004. So we are going towards the 10th anniversary next year. And the resolution has reaffirmed that the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, as well as their means of delivery, constitutes a threat to international peace and security. Therefore, the Council in 2004 decided that all states shall refrain from providing any form of support to non-state actors that attempt to develop, acquire, manufacture, possess, transport, transfer, or use nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and their means of delivery, and requires all states to adopt and enforce appropriate effective laws to this effect. The resolution also requires that all states establish various types of domestic controls to prevent the proliferation of such weapons and the related materials. In the context of the resolution, a non-state actor is an individual or an entity which does not act under the lawful authority of any state. The Security Council Committee was established pursuant to the resolution in 2004 and is also to report to the Council on the implementation of the Resolution 1540. The committee has just been extended for another 10 years in 2011, and the mandate until 25 April 2011. The resolution also recognizes the process of the Nuclear Security Summit, that it supports the implementation of Resolution 1540. The resolution also builds upon existing international treaties, especially the NPT, this Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, and also shall not be interpreted to conflict with any of the mandates of the respective entities like the IAEA or the OPCW. This was my introduction, and now I would like to introduce the panelists, and I have the pleasure to introduce to you distinguished panelist, Dr. Toksang Kasenova. She is an associate nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace. In her previous positions, she currently also serves at the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. She is a senior research associate at the University of Georgia's Center for International Trade and Security, and she is the author of From Antagonism to Partnership, The Uneasy Path of the US-Russian Cooperative Threat Reduction in 2007. So welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
And the next panelist is Ms. Liv Jadong Liu. She is an expert to the expert group of the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 Committee. And her previous positions where she was in charge of different arms control issues, such as the national implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, in charge of non-proliferation policy and export controls at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, and Dr. Shin Chang-hun. He is the director of the ASEAN Nuclear Technology and Policy Center, ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies, and currently also a research fellow. He taught public international law, international organizations, international economic law, and law of the sea as a lecturer at the Seoul National University and Myonggi University. And he specializes in dispute settlement, law of the sea, international environment law, and international humanitarian law. So I welcome the panelists, and I give the floor to Dr. Casanova. You have the floor, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to ASEAN Institute for having me here. It's a pleasure. I was asked to talk about the role of industry in non-proliferation because it's one of the actors that is recognized as important, but nobody in our circles, in the circles of policy experts, has good understanding of what the companies think or what the industry thinks and what does it mean for them to implement non-proliferation controls. And to begin, I want to set the stage and spend a couple of minutes on explaining what's the changing landscape of the proliferation threats that we are facing. And the reality is that if before proliferation, the sources for potential proliferation were mostly coming from military or defense industries, now in our age of advanced high-tech industries and us using dual-use technologies and materials in many sectors that have nothing to do with military programs, what we have is a completely different environment in which goods that are very broadly used, broadly traded, might contribute to a WMD program of an actor that is not responsible. So on one hand, we have the situation that we do have to engage the industry because they are one of the key partners in preventing proliferation. On the other hand, as I've mentioned before, there is still this lack of communication between policymakers, industry, policy experts, and academia. So it's my opportunity here, which I'm happy to use, to talk a little bit about why industry is important and how the industry views the problem of proliferation. First of all, I want to argue that it's industry that is the first line of defense against proliferation. For example, imagine that one of you is, well, I don't want to imagine, but hypothetically that, for example, you are a potential terrorist or a bad actor that wants to acquire some kind of weapons capability. So you go around and you try to exploit export control gaps in weak systems. You are trying to procure some components that can be useful for you. And this is exactly where the companies can be our first line of defense because it's them who can recognize a suspicious order better than anybody else. It's not me, it's not you, it's not anybody just sitting and talking about these technologies or materials abstractly. It's actually the company which is either producing or trading these items that would know if you would be, for example, a hospital, you would need only 5 items of this equipment, but you are requesting 100 items. Why? So it's those who have the best knowledge of certain products that would be able to distinguish what is suspicious and what isn't. They are the ones who would be able to recognize that usually our customers like us to provide some maintenance support. And this suspicious customer, he say, no, just sell me the stuff, send it via this very unusual route, and I do not need any follow-up service. So, number one, industry has the best knowledge to recognize if anything suspicious is happening. on another level, when governments try to develop, for example, export control laws or regulations that would help these countries to prevent proliferation, it's the industry on which they can rely. If you engage those companies, if you engage industry representatives in the process of developing these laws, in the process of developing these regulations, you have a better buy-in. They feel that you're listening to them. They can also advise on what regulations are not feasible or maybe too complicated or do not make sense. Why else the industry is important? Because imagine you are the government and you have these laws and regulations, you do everything, you ask the companies who trade in dual-use items to apply for a license, a permission to sell certain goods from this country A to country B. And you also have perfect laws which say if anybody sold these items without a license, they'll be fined and so on. You have two scenarios. One scenario in which you have many bad companies who do not comply. They violate, and you have to spend time, you have to spend resources on trying to punish them for that. So your valuable time is wasted. On the other hand, a second scenario is when you have industry which is compliant, which believes that it's very important to prevent proliferation, and then the government does not have to waste its valuable time and resources on prosecuting the violations. So again, it's very important to engage the industry and to have it on your side. Moving to my second theme, what can governments do so that industry is interested and is willing to be an active actor in preventing proliferation? The governments should keep very open channels of communication. So, for example, if you have key industry stakeholders, they know that they can call a certain government office if they have any questions or if they're in doubt about anything. That there is always this open channel between the government and the companies. But also, you know, we live in a world where it's all about interests and very tangible incentives. So in that respect, if the government introduces some incentives for the companies, for example, they say if you comply and if you are very diligent and you are very careful with your decisions about where you sell your goods that might be proliferation sensitive, then we'll make it easier for you to get permissions, to get licenses, and so on. And now moving to my last theme, and that's kind of, until now I was talking more from the point of the non-proliferation field, what we want, why is it important, and what governments should do. But let's look at it from the industry's vantage point. And for them, if you're a good company, you do not want to proliferate. You do not want to have a bad reputation or your company name to be splashed across newspapers and as a company that sold something that ended up in North Korea and would be used for its nuclear program, for example. So that's kind of the reputational aspect is an intangible motivation for companies to be diligent. But there are also very tangible external pressures. Just to give you an example, for example, if you are in South Korea, you are a South Korean company which needs to import some high-tech goods from the US, for example. The US has very strict rules on to which companies can US companies send their stuff. So if you are not up to the standard, you cannot participate in the trade to your benefit. But there are also challenges that industry faces. Implementing those controls, doing all these checks and trying to understand your customer, maybe saying no to some orders, that costs money it requires resources. The second problem or very serious challenge that the companies face is that if you're a multinational company trading with many different countries, the laws are so different. There are no standard lists. Very often there are no standard lists. So you have to go through this maze of legislation of other countries, which complicates things for you and makes it challenging to comply. And finally, it's difficult sometimes for the companies. For example, you are selling your goods that are dual use to a company that has, you've checked and it sounds reasonable. They're not asking for anything that makes you suspicious. But you do not know what's going to happen after your product reaches this company or this country. What's happening to this product later on and who the final end user will be. It's very difficult to control. Again, it requires resources and it's just very challenging. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to engage the industry, we need to interest them in preventing proliferation, and we should also be aware that it's not always very easy for them to comply, and we have to think how to make it all work to everybody's benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Ms. Jadonglu.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies, especially Dr. Xin, for organizing this event and inviting me here. And also, as a UN staff, I would say that the opinion expressed here is also my personal opinion. It's not represented the United Nations and also even the 1540 committee. And before I go to the discussion of the non-state stakeholders in preventing WMD proliferation, I'd like to say something about Resolution 1540. Just now, Mrs. Gabriel introduced something about this resolution, but I should say, yes, it is the first binding instrument of the United Nations Security Council to prevent the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, its means of delivery, and also its related materials to non-state actors. Here, also this resolution gives a definition to non-state actors. Since today we are discussing the role of the non-state stakeholders, so I think we are talking about the positive side of the non-government organizations, the role could play in implementing this resolution. And also, the other fact is that this resolution covers all areas of weapons of mass destruction. It means that it covers nuclear, chemical, and also biological weapons, its means of delivery, and also the related materials. The third point I'd like to say that from this resolution requires a state to refrain from providing assistance to non-state actors to acquire such kind of materials and weapons. And also it requires a member state to establish effective domestic controls over those materials and items. These domestic controls included the export controls, border controls, and even physical protections of those materials and related items. So that's the main factors of this resolution. Through this resolution, the United Nations Security Council has established a positive program of steps toward the prevention of the proliferation of those weapons of mass destruction to non-state actors. And also it supplements the prohibitions on states already put in place under the NPT, CWC, and also BWC. The Security Council recognized that the primary responsibility for fighting WMD proliferation and potential terrorist use of WMD rests with UN member states. It means that the implementation of the key requirements of the resolution is the responsibility of governments. So it means that the states alone are accountable for the implementation of the resolution, and the national agencies are further responsible for enforcing this resolution. Of course, the effectiveness of the resolution will depend in large part on whether the 1540 committee and the supporting states will be able to secure global implementation, which will require substantial assistance on a broad range of activities. So from this point of view, that's why we need other partners to be involved in the process. And actually, Resolution 1540 provides for complex interactions between multiple stakeholders in this implementation. First, I will go to the large part of our cooperation, that is with international, regional, and sub-regional organizations. The Resolution 1540 and also the subsequent resolutions, especially Resolution 1977 in year 2011, recognize the role of the international, regional, and sub-regional organizations could play in facilitating the effective implementation of this resolution. They are the important non-state stakeholders in this regard. And the 1540 committee and also the expert group has cooperated with nearly 40 international, regional, sub-regional organizations in this in a mutually beneficial ways, and establish a kind of relationship to interact with all these organizations, especially the interaction with organizations who possesses the non-provision expertise like IEA, OPCW, and WHO, and also BWC implementation supporting unit. And also we interact with some regional organizations to achieve the common goal. The way of cooperation is usually through the strengthening cooperation through exchange of information, the sharing of implementation experiences and lessons learned, and also we achieve closer coordination in facilitating assistance, because 1540 committee plays a role of clearinghouse and also a matchmaking role in providing assistance to these member states. But most of this assistance should come from the outside organizations. For example, in the nuclear field, we have IAEA who play a big role in providing technical assistance to its member states in pursue the nuclear security and safety. So we depend on largely part on those international organizations to fulfill our obligations and to make this resolution effectively implemented. And also here, because here it's a regional forum, and also I would like to say regional organizations also play a crucial role to the implementation of this resolution, because they know much better than other partners know the common needs and priorities of their member states, especially the regional specifications, and they will provide or give the special advice to their member states in that regard. And also for other part, we also engaged in some intergovernmental organizations, such as the World Customs organizations and also the International Criminal Police organizations, Interpol we call it. And for the cooperation with those intergovernmental organizations, also those organizations could provide specific assistance to their member states in fulfilling the requirements of this resolution. So that's the most part of the role played by international, regional, and sub-regional organizations. And of course, here we are also talking about the civil society, because what roles the civil society could play and to what extent it could play in preventing the provision is still under discussion. And of course, there's no clear definition of what civil society is. And but to my personal opinion, that I think that civil society should be a broad concept, which embraces not only the academia, but the think tanks, private research institutes, and also private business sectors. So it should be all the partners. If you check the website of the United Nations, we have the United Nations and civil society. And there's a sentence I just quote to say that more and more non-governmental organizations and other civil society organizations are UN system partners and the valuable links with the civil society. So it demonstrates that the United Nations is devoting its efforts to the creation of a kind of productive and innovative partnership with civil society. And the experiences of engagement with civil society has been improved their contribution to the implementation of this resolution, and also reinforce the international and regional and national efforts. Just now we've mentioned, because Dr. Tongzhen is from the Center of International Trade and Security.
No, I'm not. It's my previous
Okay,
job.
sorry
but
for-
I used
okay.
to work with them.
Yeah, actually, because I do not want to list all the NGOs involved in the work of supporting the implementation of Resolution 1540, but just namely, we have Stimson Center, we have Stanley Foundation, and we have Vertic, we have CIPRI, and we have CITS, and also we have other partners. So the experiences of engagement of those international of civil society organizations prove that they could contribute to the implementation in a different ways. So that's the role. And also we conducted an event, the Civil Society Forum, that's organized by the United Nations Office for Development Affairs, and which is a great success. And more than 50 civil society organizations were presented, and they expressed their willingness to be involved in the process of implementation. So I think that the constructive involvement of all these civil society organizations could be encouraged in the future. And just now, you have already tell us a lot about industry, and also, yes, I do agree with your opinion that industry is deeply involved in the process of non-provision export control. Even the number of firms actually affected by non-provision is small, but the national legislation on export control affects all related individual companies. Industry is the implementee, I should say, of their national export control regulations and laws. So that's why to raise their awareness of the importance of export control is quite important also. And also those industries, they know their market, they know their technology, they know their users much better than other authorities or agencies. So that's why I think that they could have some role to play, to act as a kind of non-provision assets to help to implement this important resolution. And also, Resolution 1540 and especially Resolution 1977 encourage the 1540 committee to work with the industry, civil society, to draw on their expertise. And so, and also last year, also with the help of the United Nations Office for Development Affairs, there is a conference to involve industry associations into the process, launched in Wiesbaden, Germany. And I think it's a good start to involve industry in this aspect. So in conclusion, what I'm trying to say is that clearly the successful implementation of the resolution will continue to rely on the commitment and the national efforts of member states themselves. But the international, regional, sub-regional organizations and civil society are all partners of the 1540 committee in implementing this resolution. I thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Dr. Shin Chang-hoon.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Well, actually, I would like to talk about 2 points. The first point is the role of civil society. I mean, why the role of civil society is so important in implementing the resolution 1540. And the other point is the significance of regional approach and regional networks, particularly in Northeast Asia or plus ASEAN states. Before I get to the point, I would like to say something about the background of this panel. As you may know, the agenda and the program for this forum have been organized and prepared about 6 months ago. So, for instance, to put this panel in the program, I went to New York to meet the persons from the United Nations and the expert groups of the Resolution 1540. And I was really touched by their statements, especially the civil society's role. So I did not hesitate to put this panel into the program for this forum. But as you know, there are just several participants. I think I failed in attracting the audiences.
No, it's because it's second day afternoon. Don't take it
That's
personally.
right.
The last
Yes, frankly speaking, the third nuclear test conducted by North Korea, well, helped us, but distracted us as well. Anyway, I do not regret that I put this panel into the program because it is really important for the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies as an independent institution. Back to my presentation, the keyword for my presentation are 2. The first one is public awareness of the Resolution 1540. And another keyword is non-proliferation culture. Three excellent panelists already explained the significance of the Resolution 1540. The Resolution 1540 are very peculiar in some reasons, particularly from the lawyers' perspectives. It prohibits any proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction, not between states, but to and from non-state actors. And secondly, it applies to the means of delivery, as you already mentioned, as well as the weapons and related materials. In accordance with resolution, member states are obliged to adopt and enforce appropriate legislative measures and to establish domestic controls to prevent the proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons and their means of delivery and related materials. However, at the initial of this resolution, individuals as a non-state actor were considered as nothing but an addressee of the resolution and its national implementing legislation. Even industry, which deals with dual-use items, was also considered as an addressee of the resolution and national regulations. However, nowadays the stakeholders, very complicating world, stakeholders of the Resolution 1540, there have been some change of paradigm in dealing with non-state actors at the domestic as well as at the international levels. For instance, there have been campaigns for securing participation of industry and civil society, even in making national legislation which implements the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540. The resolution applies to all weapons of mass destruction, means of delivery, and related materials. I repeat every time, but amongst them, only the nuclear materials have drawn the highest political attention due to the Nuclear Security Summit. Therefore, the Nuclear Security Summit also supports the United Nations Resolution 1540 in strengthening global nuclear security and welcomed the extension of its mandate. Particularly, Seoul Communique, the result of the 2012 Seoul Nuclear Security Summit, clearly categorized the resolution as a piece of global nuclear security regime. In that sense, we should think whether the summit process is necessary or not for biological or chemical weapons and their related materials. But it sounds unimaginable story in the near future. Summit process is good for attracting a high-level attention, political attention, I mean. But the thing is that can the process attract public awareness of the issue? At this moment, we should put emphasis on the spread out non-proliferation culture to the public. The emphasis on the non-proliferation culture will lead to the adoption of bottom-up approach in dealing with active participation of civil society and industry in dealing with the issue of non-proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction to and from non-state actors. If I borrow the analysis of Managing Director Brian Finley at Stimson Center, well, actually, I was invited to Vienna January conference, which deals with the civil society's role in implementing the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540. But unfortunately, I couldn't make it because of this forum. Well, actually, it is true. The central role for civil society, she said, should be to assess their irrespective national governments, to their respective national governments. But even in this regard, I think the non-proliferation culture really matters. Distinguished audience and panelists, the prevention of proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction is of essence to national security. But I think it may be more essential to the safety of the daily life of our ordinary individuals. It has been argued that the individuals have concluded a contract with their government, that the government will protect the safety and security of the individuals in return for levying taxes on them. However, as the paradigm of non-proliferation has shifted from the relation only between the states to the relation to and from non-state actors, the participation of civil society in monitoring national legislation should be guaranteed. And further, the participation of civil society in rulemaking should also be guaranteed for sustainable and effective national legislation to implement the Resolution 1540. Finally, I want to mention the significance of regional approach, particularly building of regional implementation or monitoring network in Northeast Asia plus ASEAN states. I strongly support a regional implementation network of government agencies, civil society actors, private industry, and international, regional, and sub-regional organizations is essential to meeting the mandate of the resolution, particularly in Northeast Asia, plus the ASEAN. There must be a regional network to counter any trial of North Korea to proliferate the weapons of mass destruction to and from non-state actors. I mean, means of delivery as well, and any related materials as well. The ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies in this regard, I mean the host of this forum, is also keenly interested in such regional network as an independent institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the contributions, and I just would like to start the discussion and come back to the panelists. Especially now, the first focus on industry. I have a question, because industry, what do we mean with industry? I mean, do we mean big corporate industry? Do we mean small businesses and small companies? Do we mean in the context of non-proliferation? Do we mean production facilities? Do we mean transport, transshipment, aerospace? I mean, there's a huge world of industry outside, and there is postal service. Are they involved?
No, well, I wouldn't go that far to the postal service. I would say the relevant stakeholders, they are the companies which either produce or trade in high-tech materials and technology that can be considered to be dual use. These are the materials and technology that can either be used for completely peaceful purposes or for weapons purposes. I think the shippers are also important, but that's another layer. I think, if at least we get at the suppliers, then it will be already good enough. But I'm not as ambitious as to include postal service into my definition of relevant industry stakeholders.
Thank you. Is there anything in all the presentations, so-called best practices, where we can learn from? Where also, when you mentioned regional cooperation and so, where you have a network of the academia, civil society, industry, government, and so, is there anything of best practices of international organizations? Definitely have also so-called best practices. Is there any contribution those best practices could be an added value in this non-proliferation context? Do you have any suggestions?
Are you
on
asking
this? Everybody of the panel.
Yeah, you go first, but I can also add.
Oh, yes, okay. I think, well, in the United States, well, as well, Ms. You already mentioned, well, there are so many, foundations and civil societies which are keenly involved in the networks, so such as Stimson, Stanley Foundations. So they are sharing, well, the data, and for instance, the sites in the Georgia Tech University.
Georgia University, not Georgia.
I'm sorry, yes. Is also dealing with such kind of issues. And unfortunately, in the Northeast Asia and the ASEAN states, well, actually, there is some movements. For instance, we have CISCAP meeting. But in the CISCAP meeting, there has been lots of sharing best practices with regard to national legislations, but specifically in Northeast Asia, we couldn't build up such kind of networks. So that's what I want to raise the issues of the regional networks in Northeast Asia.
On the other hand, in terms of government-industry relationship, Northeast Asia is one of the best examples, because Japan has an organization, it's semi-governmental, it's called CISTEC. Mm-hmm. I forgot the full name, but it's the Center for International Security and something, and they work specifically as a link between the government and the Japanese companies. And same for South Korea,
yes,
KOSTI. It's another entity that works as a link between the government and the industry. And I think these two examples are showing that Asia Pacific in some respects is ahead compared to some other regions.
Actually, the subsequent resolution of 1540, resolution 1977, calls upon the member states to provide additional information and also on voluntary basis, of course, the effective practices. We call it effective practices, not best practices. And it's just recognized that the member states provide their effective practices to the committee. It's not called upon the role played by the civil society to provide such kind of assistance. But I know that in reality that there has a kind of organizations did the evaluation work and they piled the effective practices. For example, the CIPRI is working with the European Union and to identify the best practice of that region and to give the examples of that region. So I think yes, it is the added value of this the work to the implementation of this resolution. So we also encourage that it should be more effective practices be in place and be provided to the committee.
And may I just add my 2 cents? I think in order to move it from the abstract discussion of civil society's role in how it's helping the implementation of 1540, I just wanted to explain what, for example, my everyday job involved when I worked for the University of Georgia. For example, there would be countries that would want to develop an export control law, but they would require technical assistance. And that's where civil society actors like the University of Georgia and Center for International Trade and Security, they would come in and help with drafting the law, maybe sharing the international examples from other countries, what the components of the legislation, of the regulations might be. So it's quite tangible. It's not only about organizing a conference, for example, and talking about the importance of 1540, although it's very important for public awareness, but it's also sometimes it's something very, very tangible.
Thank you. I also heard very interesting point on non-proliferation culture. What do we mean? Do we mean a comprehensive CBRN, security culture? We know from nuclear security, there's nuclear security culture. Are we looking at this, or do you mean more the industry, which has a corporate responsibility? What do you mean exactly with non-proliferation culture?
Well, actually, it concludes everything you mentioned. So, for instance, corporate social responsibility is one of them. In dealing with prevention of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly biological weapons and chemical weapons, it is related to the dual-use items. So the ordinary items we are using can be converted to the use of for military purposes. But if a society doesn't have any culture with regard to non-proliferation, then people just think, everyday use of dual items is nothing but has nothing to do with proliferation issues. So we have to always train the public that there has been a lot of sensitive issues with regard to non-proliferation regime of the dual use items. So, however, unfortunately, it is my personal perception that in South Korea, we could not find any kind of training systems for the proliferation of dual-use items. We have strong export system, but it's a matter of, people just think it's a matter of government. So that's why I would like to put emphasis on the culture of non-proliferation, particularly on the dual-use items.
And again, so that it doesn't sound abstract when we refer to dual-use items. Just to give you an example, you probably know semiconductor chips and semiconductor material that are used, for example, to produce computer chips. And we need them for everything, for telephones, for computers, for radios. But certain types of products that use semiconductor material, they can be also very useful for high precision equipment that is, of course, very important in weapons programs. So just to kind of give at least one example of what a dual use item is.
Right. So it is really difficult to define the exact definition of the dual-use items. For instance, well, in coffee, there are some chemical substances which can be used for military purposes.
And also to control the dual-use items is also a challenge of inventing the resolution 1540, because some of the countries do ask a question that what is dual-use means, and because resolution 1540 do not have a common list, we do not list the items, so it depends on national legislation. So usually people will come to ask, so what do you want us to control? So usually, yes, dual-use control is the most challenging part from our work, and we are still trying to find a way.
Because again, if to bring it to the real life, if you are at the customs, if you're a customs officer or at border control, you see an item that looks completely innocent, and it's very difficult to tell whether it might be a controlled item or not. So at the level of implementation as well, not only when you are drafting your laws and regulations and come up with national control lists, but also at the next step, at making sure that you implement your own laws and regulations. It's very challenging to have enough capacity to implement those controls.
And also, now in the export control field, we have a catch-all clause. It means that catch-all, so you have everything inside. So you just, you should know your customer, you should know your technology, you should know your item, just to make sure that it could not be used for WMD-related activities, something. But it's still, catch-all is still a very challenging part, and so how to define.
Thank you. On awareness raising of the resolution and the requirements of the resolution, where do you start? I mean, it has to be implemented by member states of the United Nations, or by all states, in fact. And then when we look then in the involvement of the private sector, civil society, and so, do we go below that? Do we go in academia? I understand there is a, for example, you get a master degree in nuclear security. Is there anything where training, because you mentioned you have no regional training possibilities, but is there anything on the education side where you can start even at an earlier stage for the education part?
Well, actually, as I said, well, as you know, at this audience, well, we could not find any Korean interested in this panel. It's really difficult to train the industry and the civil society. But the thing is that I would like to put emphasis on the safety, as I mentioned, safety of our daily life. The items, the dual items gave us a lot of benefits in our daily life, but it also may be a threat to our daily life as well. So I think, well, in universities and in industry, I mean, well, in private sectors, there must be well, at least, well, some educational systems which, I mean, which can spread out the value of non-proliferation of dual items. So, especially, I mean, prevent use for military purposes. So some, I think, affiliated institutions, affiliated in the government, regularly try to educate industry with regard to non-proliferation regime of the dual-use items. But we have to put the educators together and then coordinate what kind of contents of the education should be at minimum, what kind of contents should be included in their regular education systems.
A minimum requirement, a PhD in 1540.
1540.
Exactly.
Yes, definitely. 1540 is, yes, baseline.
Thank you. I open the floor now for any questions from the audience. Do you have any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Pyeong-seok Baek from the Asan Institute. I don't know whether my question is directly related with the panel theme, but I'd like to ask a question about the PSI and the Resolution 1540. While the PSI and the Resolution 1540 are complementary in that they both bring together countries in partnership to fight against the WMD-related trafficking, but many countries, including China, made it clear that the resolution by no means endorses PSI or the type of activities associated with it. Despite this, the PSI participating countries continue to point to the resolution as the legal justification for activities under the initiative. So I'd like to hear your opinions or thoughts on the relationship between the PSI and the Resolution 1540. Thank you.
Do you want to go?
Please.
Yes, it's just the objective of PSI is to interdict or to stop the transfer of the related materials from the by ships, by plane, or by other transporting means. And I know there are hot debate about the legitimacy of that initiative. Also, I'm also doubt about, for example, to interdict a ship on a common sea is legal or not is still a question. So, and also PSI is different with United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540. Why I'm saying that is because PSI is much more like a kind of like-minded groups, countries working together and to find ways to stop such kind of transportation. But United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540 is a comprehensive resolution, covers all these kind of activities, and also its binding instrument is approved. It's a binding to all the member states of United Nations. It's not just a part of small group countries, and also it's legal. It provides a legal basis for that. So I know that PSI is, I think you have nearly more than 20 and nearly 30 countries participating states, but it's still under discussion about the legitimacy of the activities.
Well, actually, if I correct you, almost 98 states are participating in the PSI. Well, there has been serious debates on the legality of the PSI among the international lawyers. So I do not want to go into the details about the legality of the PSI, because it is just kind of voluntary partnership, not the international law. But the thing is that every member states has its own right to choose more stringent measures based upon the United Nations Security Council resolutions. So in this context, PSI is understandable.
Are there any other questions? Yes, please.
Talking about civil society and industry, do organizations like the World Institute of Nuclear Security, WINS, interact with you at the 1540 committee? And then a follow-up question is, do organizations like WINS exist in the chemical and biological security realms? And if so, do they interact with you?
Thank you. Shadow.
Actually, during my presentation, I have said that we did cooperate a lot with such a kind of international and regional organizations in dealing with, for example, in the nuclear security, we cooperated with IAEA, and because Resolution 1540, we do not have a kind of assistance mechanism. We are just a clearinghouse, and we just function as a matchmaking role in providing assistance to our member states. So if a request of assistance comes from a member state, we will pass it on to relevant international organizations or regional organizations, ask them to provide technical assistance in that regard. So that's the main function of our committee and our role to play in providing assistance. So it's more just a kind of clearinghouse role to play. So in different areas, we will ask for different expertise from different organizations to provide assistance.
Do you want to add something? On the practical side, you always have the practical implementation. Yes, please.
So my question is a little general. So in the proximity of the 10th anniversary of the resolution, I would like to listen to your opinions about the effectiveness of the system. And in that sense, do you think that the fact that the resolution deals with nuclear material together with biological and chemical agents was a good step to go in order to talk about weapons of mass destruction in general? Or perhaps just putting into separate boxes nuclear, chemical, and biological would have been better or worse as a possibility? Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I can, you can start.
Okay, I just start. Yes, the Resolution 1540 covers all the three categories of weapons. And of course, by legislation, of course, is different in respective member states. But I thought that most of them combine all this legislation into one. So, for example, you just say the transport of nuclear, chemical, biological materials and related materials is illegal, or they have put in this sentence into a kind of legislative wording. But usually they put all together, not just separately to say this is nuclear, this is chemical, and this is biological. But usually when a state trying to make legislation, they will put all these things together and to cover all those sensitive materials and items. And also it is encouraged to have a kind of comprehensive approach to control all those sensitive materials. But also there has been some different practices in different aspects. For example, if a country just wants to implement the Convention on the nuclear terrorism, maybe he just make a law concerning that convention. So maybe just nuclear oriented. So it does not put chemical and biological into that legislation. So it's different. It depends on the national legislation system to decide.
And I have the luxury of the freedom of not working for the United Nations. So I would give you my opinion. I sincerely believe that the resolution was a very important contribution And even though the language was quite vague, it says adequate export controls or efficient controls, and there is no real benchmark, but I believe it's the reality of it. You would have never been able to agree on a text that would be more specific. So that weakness is something that everybody has to live with, and it was unavoidable. I think that initially the way the resolution was perceived, especially in some of the regions, was much more negative. There was real allergy, to the fact that, why the UN is legislating. They shouldn't. And countries had real concerns about the lack of resources, for example, or lack of interest. They would think it's not really our primary concern. We have other more important issues to deal with, and why do we have to spend our limited resources on implementing the resolution? I'm very happy to see that throughout the regions we see a much better acceptance and much better awareness of what the resolution is about and why it's important. Talking about some of the weaknesses, the way it works is that the committee receives reports from the countries, so it kind of relies on the goodwill and honesty of the submitting countries. And the committee and the experts group that supports the committee are just not in a position to, they can ask follow-up questions, but it's not like they have the capacity or the authority to question. So they work off the reports. The quality of reports is very different. You have submissions of 20 pages, but you also have submissions of 2 pages. And I've seen some reports where the country would say, we have an export control law, and then you go back to the legislation in the original language, and it's actually a customs law, which has nothing to do with WMD non-proliferation. But they would have, the kind of tick that they have relevant legislation. So I think that's the shortcoming, that the capacity of the committee and of the experts group is limited, and due to political and technical reasons, they cannot really evaluate properly, and probably it's not their job. And also for me, as an analyst of who is interested in seeing what is the true capacity of countries to implement export controls, very often those reports and matrices would be very focused on the legislation. And you can have all the laws you want, but if you do not have enough customs officers or you don't have X-ray equipment, it's really, the capacity, I think, is where the focus should be. And I understand the limitations, but yeah, so there are some challenges, but we're much better off that we have this framework, and luckily we have a better attitude to the resolution.
If I tell you my, I have time? Okay, if I tell you my opinions on your questions, well, actually, between states, nuclear weapons, proliferation of nuclear weapons issue is dealt with by the NPT. And with regards to chemical weapons or biological weapons, we have CWC and BWC. But in case of the relations to and from non-state actors, we don't have such kind of international instruments. So when the UN resolution, Security Council Resolution 1540 was published to the public, there has been serious debates about the role of the United Nations Security Council in creating international norms. But I think it is too well formalistic approach. So I think, well, in case of the non-state actors, I think there must be a certain positive movements in order to fill the gaps, I mean, in order to cure the weakest points in our international non-proliferation regime. So I think we can, well, combine these weapons together and then make and then apply comprehensive approaches only to the relations to and from non-state actors.
And among some tangible positive outcomes of the resolution, there are at least a couple of countries that developed export control laws specifically with the WMD non-proliferation in mind, and even in the preambles to their laws, they would say that's in reaction to the resolution 1540. So it kind of, it forced it's
Yeah.
positive.
Actually, even though the implementation of this resolution is not perfect, we say, but I should say that during these 9 years of awareness raising and the implementation, I think that Resolution 1540 through its committee and the work of that expert group has achieved a lot. We have 169 member states submitted their first report to the committee. Only 24 left. So I think that this number says something. So that's achievement of the daily work of the committee and also.
Thank you. So there is some momentum. I see one more question from the audience. We have 4 more minutes.
Thank you. Tongzang, in one of your papers, you are an opinion that actually the 1540 is does not put extra burden on the industry or on the member countries at all, and on the contrary, the 1540 is it doesn't it doesn't put burdens on the countries at all, and you try to argue that on the contrary, it facilitates trade. And I think this is quite little known to to people, because people tend to argue that we have to show the extra costs and burdens, and it could impede international trade. But you could prove otherwise in the papers. I think this is a very good point. I think you could tell people a little bit about that. It is very encouraging, things to hear. Thank you.
Thank you for asking this question. It kind of gets at this very core tension of countries saying we do not have resources and it's difficult. I come to this from 2 sometimes conflicting perspectives. First is me, coming from a developing country of Kazakhstan, recognizing the challenges that developing countries face. On the other hand, from the non-proliferation point of view, I absolutely support the resolution, and I think it's important. So what I was trying to do is to look at the overlap. I think we have to go into this with due respect to the country's concerns and what they say is important to them. So what I tried to do in the study that Tuan kindly mentions is to look at the overlap, where the interests of the countries overlap with the interests of non-proliferation. And there are some areas, for example, several countries in Southeast Asia, they are much more worried about small arms smuggling, drug smuggling, not about smuggling of nuclear material, for example. But if you look at the capacity that would help them to prevent small arms smuggling, it's the same equipment. It's X-ray equipment, it's trained customs people. So you can kind of have this dual use in a positive way of the resources that you are spending. In terms of trade, as I, in my remarks on the industry, that if a country has a good export control system, it means that it can benefit more from the international trade, it can engage more in high-tech transfers with other countries. So while I do not say that it doesn't involve any resources from the countries or from the governments, I think it's also important to shift the angle and try to look, this is what's important for you, I respect that, and this is where we can combine the non-proliferation goals and development and economic and trade goals.
Thank you very much. We have to conclude the panel. I thank the panelists. Please join me in applause.